Hi, everyone. It's lovely having you join us today. I'm Sin from ArtScience Museum in Singapore and your host for today's program, Orchestral Manoeuvres, Curators in Dialogue with Adrian George and Amita Kirpalani. This curatorial talk is presented in conjunction with the opening of Orchestral Manoeuvres, See Sound, Feel Sound, Be Sound for ArtScience Museum's 10th anniversary. The exhibition explores sound through sculpture, installation, and music, bringing together 32 artists and composers whose works expand how we think about, experience, and understand sound, encouraging us to listen more closely to the spaces we inhabit and the sounds around us. Orchestral Manoeuvres is curated by our Director of Exhibitions, Adrian George, with our curator, Amita Kirpalani. We're going to start shortly with a talk by Adrian and Amita, and afterwards we will be taking questions from the floor during Q&A. Would love to hear from you throughout the program today, so please share your comments, thoughts, and questions with us in the live chat, whether you're joining us from Facebook or YouTube. It gives me great pleasure welcoming Adrian and Amita for their talk.
Hi, Sin.
Hi, Sin.
Thanks.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm passing over the
Good.
time to you, Adrian and Amita.
Okay, thank you so much. So, Amita, I think we're just going to walk through the exhibition and have a conversation as we go along, which is what we've been doing for months anyway. So,
Yeah, it's same old for us.
yes. So, do you want to kick us off by starting with the first slide, or how do you want to go?
Let's start with the first slide. I think that's a good idea. So I think we've got to start at the beginning. And the first question I want to put to you is the inspiration for the kind of guts of this exhibition, which is examining the relationship between sound and music through sculpture.
So let's look at the first slide because that gives the game away. So Lyra, if you can move to the first slide, that'd be great. So this is my maternal granddad, Edgar Jones, who was a very accomplished musician. He studied at the Royal College of Music and was graduating in 1930 or something like that. And he was a very talented, patient, and kind man who spent many years trying to teach me how to play the piano and read music. Unfortunately, I'm not a very talented student or a talented musician, so I'm far, far away in terms of my accomplishments than he was. But it did, he and his teaching did introduce me to an extraordinary range of music, from high Renaissance right through to whatever was contemporary at that time. And so that passion for music has stayed with me throughout my life, really. But that's just the bare bones of it. There are other inspirations for this exhibition, which we will kind of see as we progress through the exhibition. So if we look at them,
if we're taking the audience on a little stroll, let's walk inside. Let's walk into the first space with the next slide.
Cool. Okay, so this artwork I saw for the first time in 2019, actually, in London, where Hannah had a studio at Somerset House, and she also had this installation there, along with some other works. And I was immediately taken by it because it's such a beautiful physical manifestation of sound in the space. You can see what we mean if we move on to the next slide, which I won't talk across, but let's just see the artwork in action, and then we can have a conversation a bit more about it afterwards. So let's play it. So Amita, you have written about this. You have written about this very beautifully, as describing it as two sinuous lines that bisect the space. And I think that was very beautifully put, because they are very sort of embodied somehow. They embody sound in the space.
And I wonder if you could talk about why you want to start here, or why you want our visitors to start at this point.
Yeah, so this gallery is all about resonance, which is this kind of phenomenon of solids and gases and liquids which respond to sound waves. And so all sound is born of moving air, basically. And so the deep bass tones which are being produced by the speakers on the back of these sculptures, they don't actually touch the surface film. It's just the sound that's making the film vibrate. So this is really a kind of manifestation of resonance. You can actually see it physically in the space, the relationship between the sound and the physical action of the sculpture.
I like, in our early conversations, we talked a lot about why start with resonance. And of course, there's that relationship, as you said, that we can visually see sound when it moves across water, for example, or we'll get to Carsten Nicolai's in a moment. But also, of course, the act of listening for most of us, the act of hearing, is the way that sound passes into our ear canal, and then the middle ear vibrates. So we're really seeing this in the space. But my next question, I guess, is about Carsten Nicolai's work, Milch, as a kind of companion piece to this, but a much more discrete companion piece. And I wonder why, as most of us would know, Carsten Nicolai is known for these large-scale sound installations. And I think you've always been quite fixed and determined to show this body of work. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, the first thing to say is Carsten is going to be doing something for us later in the run of the exhibition, which is going to be much more kind of a spectacle. So we always had this in mind, that he would do something performative for us. So that's coming up. So keep your eye on the future program.
Exciting.
And in light of that, knowing that that was going to be on the agenda for later in the exhibition run, I thought, let's take a different aspect of Carsten's work, this very kind of subtle, quite minimal, very kind of reflective, sensitive work, and present those in relation to Hannah's work. So the Milch series are photographic works which show the effect of different frequencies, sound frequencies, on the surface of a body of milk. So it's a perfect conversation between Hannah's work and Carsten's work, and they just seem to complement each other so beautifully. So I thought it was a really nice pairing.
Yeah, they really reflect each other, and we, of course, see ourselves as visitors who've been to see the show might recall. We can see ourselves in the kind of skin of Hannah Perry's work. But should we turn the corner and move into the next gallery called Performing Objects? And while we're here looking at these three artworks, I need to ask you, what is a performing object?
Oh, tricky question. So I think there are a number of performing objects. We've just seen a performing object, actually. Hannah's sculpture, a kinetic work like that, is a performing object. And there are a number of other performing objects as we go through the exhibition. But I think these are very, very evidently sculptures which are built to contain and then release sound somehow. So they are in that kind of performative mode from the conception. So the one, I'm going to just talk about them briefly. The one on the back right that we're looking at here is kind of the original one. So this is the Robert Morris box with the sound of its own making. Morris being so famous as the high minimalist for creating sculptures, which were basically all cubic. Most of them were cubic. And so this is another cube. It's made of wood. He made it himself. And the sawing, hammering, and sanding sounds were recorded and are contained within the box itself. And then the one on the left at the back is a 21st century homage to Robert's piece, which is by Ashley Zuklinski. She's an American artist, and she produced a 3D printed version, which again contains the sound of its own making. And when we were looking at this, what I started to realize was that there's this kind of gesture to the way that sound has changed across the years. So at the time when Robert was making that box, the only way to make a box like that was to make it yourself with these very manual kind of processes. But then by the time we get to Ashley's generation, you can just tell the 3D printer to print a box, and the sound is very different. And this will relate actually to what we're going to discuss a little bit later, which is the work of Luigi Russolo and the Italian Futurists, which is another starting point for the exhibition. When we get to that, maybe I'll come to that when we get to it.
I'm interested. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm interested in the way that this art history story that you've just told us, that is represented here in this space, is absolutely also evident in daily life. This kind of connection with materials, the sounds that they make, and then the kind of outsourcing of 3D printing rather than making it yourself. Like, this is a contemporary subject's dilemma, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And for me anyway, I think I'm interested in how Tim Ulrich's work also speaks to this.
Well, you know about this work better than I did, because this was your baby during the course of this exhibition. So Tim's work is basically an analog radio receiver, which is trapped in a concrete box, not exactly a cube. And of course, when it was made, most radio broadcasts were, well, all radio broadcasts were analog. And now we have the situation where most broadcasts are digital. So what once would have been playing music or a radio station or human voices from an analog radio broadcast is now picking up just static, because there aren't that many radio stations that are broadcasting analog signals anymore. And so this really manifests as kind of like this diachronic thing across history, where the sounds around us have changed and are constantly changing. And so there are sound memories just as there are visual memories. And this is another artwork which steps between the history and now.
A moment ago, you described this space as a kind of representation of like containment, or I think you even used the word sound that's trapped, and then a kind of release. And this makes me want to turn around the corner here and look at the next chapter called Sounds Around, which is a really complex space in the exhibition, because we're telling multiple stories at once. But perhaps to pick up on the most obvious one and start with, you've always described this space as a kind of reference to being in the world, what we tune into and what we tune out of. And how, I guess I'm interested to kind of unpick or unpack the way that you see this space as a kind of referencing the world in a really complex way. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, this is a very complex space, and it kind of picks up on some of the themes of the previous space, and it also starts to preface some of the themes of the next space. So there's a lot going on in this particular gallery. But if we look at the image, which is on the left of the screen right now, which contains the two works on the wall by Zul Mahmood. On the circular dais, there's a work by Chen Zhen, and in the back corner, there's a cluster of works by the Taiwanese artist Xiaochen Cheng. These three works in particular reference the idea of the sounds which are actually around us in our everyday life. You know, our ears don't blink, so we are constantly receiving auditory stimulation. Our eyes blink, and we spend, hopefully, 6 or 8 hours a night asleep, where our eyes are closed and we're not receiving visual information. But that doesn't happen with our ears. We're kind of swimming in an ocean of sound most of us all the time. So our brains have this extraordinary ability to like tune out some sounds and focus on other sounds. But two of the artists in here, Xiao Shenchen and Chen Zhen, they both have made recordings which are, actually no, Chen Zhen made a recording. Xiao, we'll come back to him, it's a bit different. But a recording of the environment that he was in when he created the work. So his kind of hometown where he was creating work there. So it's a very sort of ambient sound of everyday life in China. And it kind of produces this ostinato, or this sort of baseline of sound works in this exhibition space. It's always playing, but it's moving up and down in terms of its volume and the kind of sounds that it's producing. Xiao's work is maybe a little bit more nostalgic, but he has created these kinetic objects which, through their action, produce the sounds of birds or insects that he misses so much from his childhood village in Taiwan. And it was only when he moved to the big city, he realized that he missed the sounds of nature around him and started to experiment with making works which somehow recreated those sounds. So they're not recordings, they're sounds which are produced live in the space. So that's about sound memory and things that we suddenly realize we miss, even though we weren't 100% conscious of it while they were around us. And then Zul's work, which is wall-based, is a bit more high-tech and have these little motors which tap kind of a maze of copper pipe works, which are included in the framed components. These are very, I think the sound is very percussive and pervasive, but the exciting thing about working with Xiao and Zul is that they understood that Chen Zhen's work was going to be like this constant bass line. And we negotiated with the artist to kind of orchestrate the space so that there were highlights and moments where each artist could stand out in the exhibition space. So there's a moment where Zul is really occupying the space and many other spaces as well, because it's really, you can hear it, it infects other spaces. And the same with Xiao, and they just stand out.
So I think we have some video that perhaps we could watch now of Zul's work. And then we also have some video of Xiao's work, which maybe we could ask our viewers to like come on a little imaginative journey with us and imagine both of these works kind of talking to each other or making music with each other. In this space, Adrian, we had a lot of discussions about timing, sequencing, and I wonder if I've never asked you this before, but I'm interested to know your answer. Do you hate the idea of being, curator as conductor here? Not to get too inside baseball about it, but really you had to kind of think about timing and conducting these works. But I don't know if that's a bit of a yucky idea to kind of to talk to.
Well, I think maybe there is a correlation between curator and conductor. Maybe there is, because as a conductor, you're not the artist, you're not the performer, you're just someone who's trying to keep it all on track and make sure that we get to the same point at the same time. So I can see there's correlation there. So I'm not too worried about that comparison. But it was quite challenging during the selection process and during the install design to work out how everything was going to play together. I mean, that was our biggest challenge, I think, Amita, when we were designing the exhibition, to try and keep the themes together and somehow try and separate out the sound a little bit. So
and you've got moving parts here. You've got kinetic sculptures plus considering the visitor walking through the spaces. So it's hurts the brain a little bit, I think, sometimes. Perhaps we can move to the next slide.
This is an interesting one.
So when we look at, we've talked about sort of the ephemeral, the walking past, the walking, the mechanical in terms of sound or music making. But now we're committing music to the page or the tablet. And we're in the next chapter, which is writing sound. And I know that you have very complex thoughts about the stave, music as a written down thing. And I really enjoyed the way that you've described it as the score as a kind of keeper of secrets. And I wonder if you could talk about why you speak about it in those terms.
Yeah, because I've been continually frustrated by the Western score since I was about 6. I mean, it's a never-ending revelation to me. It's like I've spent years trying to remember all the things I should remember when reading a score, and it just eludes me every time. So I'm very frustrated with the score and with Western notation. So it always feels like somebody's encoded music or hidden music somehow in the score, and I can't quite extract it in the way that my granddad could. You know, he somehow would make it alive from the dead thing, which is the score. So I always wanted to explore more about scores. And one of the things that I started to explore and investigate was different forms of musical notation. And obviously, since the birth of the avant-garde score, it can be whatever you want it to be, but those are still, the avant-garde scores are all still responses to Western musical notation. And I wanted to draw attention to the fact that there were many forms of musical notation which predate Western musical notation. And so we came across this collection, the Shoyan collection, which has, I think, 20,000 documents and objects and artifacts. And they have a wonderful selection of ancient scores, including this cuneiform tablet from ancient Babylon, I think it is, which has written on it just some basic information about a piece of music which is in 3-part harmony and is using a different sort of scale. So that was fascinating for me. And then I thought, okay, well, why didn't any one of these forms of notation get the same level of attention as Western musical notation? And of course, this is all to do with cultural imperialism. So the fact that Western musical notation is the ubiquitous form across the world, and I think we've had many visitors to the exhibition who would say that they don't understand or read music or are not musicians or haven't had any musical education, but they still recognize manuscript paper, the basic stave, what a note looks like. You know, they have this kind of somehow basic understanding. So I just wanted to put these works in here because some of these forms of score are much more intuitive. Like the chant score, for instance, it seems much more natural and intuitive way of writing for the voice than writing a score, Western score anyway. I don't know how you feel about it, Amita.
Well, I guess I always see this collection of scores as a kind of like a little reminder bell of the kind of vast history, and it's situated right next to Cage, which if we hop to the next slide, I think we have here, and now seems like a good a moment as any to talk about Cage's kind of quiet, pun intended, influence throughout the project.
Yeah.
But
well, I think you can't make an exhibition about sound without including John Cage in it. So I really struggled. I really did want to, actually, because it's so obvious. But then it's also so iconic. You can't not include 4 minutes 33 seconds, which is which is all about listening to a so-called silent composition, which tunes you in onto the sounds of the environment around you. I mean, that was the whole point of it.
And you've chosen to represent it via the score, which I think is interesting given your frustration with the score.
Yeah.
But if we talk about Cage, we have to talk about performance too, I think. And then we have Yoko Ono's, we have one of the examples of her work in the show, Secret Piece here. So how have you constructed that conversation at this moment of the exhibition, and why?
This is kind of like I don't know, I'm feeling very playful about it now. I don't know why. I remember feeling very stressed about it when we were putting it together. But 4 minutes, 33 seconds is a score in the most nominal way. It's a written instruction to the musician not to play. It's in 3 movements, and every movement is tacit, which means that it's silent. You don't touch the instrument. By the way, it's not a piano piece. It can be any musical instrument. People are sometimes surprised because it's most often being performed or not performed in front of a piano. So it's kind of like a written instruction, and quite a lot of Cage's music, as it were, are more like written instructions. So, of course, he is very connected to Yoko Ono. They were in New York at the same time. They were friends. They were part of the Fluxus movement. And so I really wanted to include some of Yoko's instruction pieces, one that we see here called Secret Piece, because these are just written instructions for how to make sound or to make music. And you don't actually have to perform them. You can just read the instruction and sort of imagine it. And the sound is in your head, because most of us have this innate ability to imagine sound and almost play the soundtrack in our head. So that was an important aspect of this. And it was the beginnings of this thing where I'm kind of trying to subvert the idea of the score.
And it seems to me that we start to think about the difference between like rule making, so constructing the score, and mark making. And mark making in a kind of expanded sense, which is the performer. Like, do I stand in front of the Yoko Ono and perform it in the gallery? And of course, we hope that our visitors do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I remember someone asking us what should they do if someone started screaming in front of the Yoko Ono piece, and I said, well, you probably might want to applaud at the end of it.
Yeah, clap afterwards.
They've just recreated a Yoko Ono piece for you in the space, which would be amazing. I'd be very open to it.
And of course, like, then they're doing the time travel that we've spoken about a couple of times now.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Yoko's pieces, most of them were of the 50s and the 60s, but they can be recreated anytime. Same with John Cage. Somehow it speaks to then and it speaks to now. John Cage's silence piece, especially so because the sounds that you might have heard, or when you were having 4 minutes, 33 seconds performed or not performed, were the sounds of the 50s, right? And now we've got the sounds of like the second, moving into the third decade of the 21st century. The sounds around us are very different now. You know, every WhatsApp message is going to send you a little reminder. The vibration of your phone has got a sound that goes with it. So it's a very different sonic environment we live in now. And actually in this space, we also have the reconstruction of the Luigi Russolo music for the Intorno Rumori. So these sound-making objects, which the Italian futurists created because they didn't have musical instruments that could create the sound of the environment they were living in. So they created the Intorno Rumori to try and make these new sounds. But weirdly enough, Russolo's score is written on a 5-line stave. I mean, you know, if you think you're going to invent a whole new orchestra of musical instruments, you might also think about making a new method of scoring it. But yeah.
So let's go to the next slide and talk about the constraints and how artists are kind of pushing against the what we might perceive as the boundaries or barriers when it comes to Western notation.
Yeah, I think my granddad probably would have had a breakdown if he had seen someone using so many pieces of manuscript paper to write not music. It's kind of like,
Adrian, is this not music?
I don't know. I think this isn't music, actually. I mean, I'm sure Song Ming, yourself, and I have very different approaches to this, but I don't read this as music. I see this as a complete subversion of the notion of the manuscript. For me, Song Ming has gone and said, okay, I've bought a blank manuscript book, and instead of writing a composition, because he's a very talented musician, he can easily score his own piece or compose his own piece, no problem. He's decided to throw that all to one side, forget all the rules pertaining to sound and harmony and everything else, and make a series of abstract linear drawings, which are very, very beautiful. For me, they connect much more closely to minimalism and conceptualism than they do to sound art. They do not say sound to me, but they do to other people.
So then it becomes a question about, is it a failure to read or a failure of imagination that we can't hear what he hears, that I think is present in this work?
Yes, very much so. Whenever I see a score that I can't interpret, I always see it as a self-failure. I always think, why can't I interpret this score? I mean, there's another Cage piece in the display case there, which is called Fontana Mix, which is 10 pieces of acrylic that you're just supposed to scatter on top of the fall of the piano and somehow interpret. I mean, it blows my mind that musicians can do that. I have not even a basic understanding of how they can achieve that. But it's kind of like, it's wonderfully evocative score to have that potential. There's all that potential trapped inside that knowledge, and I wish I could.
It's like you've invited a really frustrating silent guest to your dinner party with this kinds of works that you're trying to extract.
Yeah, some really interesting. You've invited someone to your dinner party because you know that they're super interesting and they're super knowledgeable about something. But when they come to the party, they're very quiet, and you're like, no, the reason you're at this party is because I want to get all this something from you.
Yeah. So speaking of silent guests, we have a very present and loud guest in the next featured in the next slide. Melbourne.
Okay, let me talk about it before we see the video, because it's quite an extraordinary. Now, this is a performing object. This has this particular sculpture. Actually, I commissioned it in 2011, 2012 for the Government Art Collection in the UK. It was intended to mark the Olympics when London hosted the Olympics. And it's such an extraordinary piece with many stories woven through it. It's a reference to John Cage, of course, because it's a prepared pianola. It's also titled 4 minutes 33 seconds, so it references Cage's silent work. The design of it, the letterpress and the colors and the prints at the back all kind of reference Fluxus a little bit. There's a specially commissioned score, which is apparently based on the footfall of the athletes in the 1952 Winter Olympics in, I think it's Helsinki.
Why do you say apparently?
Because there's a fact fiction kind of thing going on with this work, because no one was there to document the footfall of the athletes in order to make a new composition out of it. That didn't happen. This is it's a fabrication from the mind of Mel Brimfield, the artist. There's this kind of weird ball run thing at the back, where you press the big red button may or may not work. So there's a chance element to it as well, which is another gesture back to Cage. But when it does play, it plays this a score, which is basically a paper roll with punched holes in it. So it's another form of score, which I can't read, but other people can read it. But the piano plays it, and it plays it with such personality. I mean, it's a 200-year-old piano, which has been kind of retrofitted with all these new, slightly hokey mechanics to try and make it work. Sometimes it just doesn't do what it's not supposed to do, because I think it has its own life. It really has its own life. But
are we revealing too much?
Yes, let's play.
No, I was going to ask if we're revealing too much if we say that part of the mechanism is powered by, or the entire mechanism is powered by a vacuum cleaner. Is that correct?
Yes, I think we probably shouldn't mention that, but it's true.
Too late, edit.
Okay.
But let's listen, shall we?
Let's listen to it. I love it. I love it. It's so playful, it's joyful, and it's kind of crazy fun at the same time, but so meaningful. There's a whole thing, a whole story that's woven into this about failure, because in the Helsinki Olympics, Roger Bannister did not win. He came fourth. And he also did not break the 4-minute mile in the Olympics, which is what he's famous for. But the failure at the Olympics spurred him on to train harder, and consequently, he broke the 4-minute mile record, which some people thought was impossible. So there's another story in it about failure.
But as well as failure, you've also mentioned that it is a really joyful object. That the sound, I mean, its character, she's a character. So maybe we can turn the corner and talk about another kind of joyful or extimate moment of performance, which is Phil Collins' work. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping you might talk a little here about fandom in relation to this exhibition section titled Inner Voice.
Well, I'm going to push the idea of fandom back onto you, because I know it's your favorite subject. For me, this work is all about the oldest musical instrument on the planet, which is us, the human voice, us as sound-making objects. And the people that you see in these still shots here are super fans of the British group The Smiths, who were invited by artist Phil Collins to sing kind of karaoke versions of their favorite songs from the Smiths' back catalogue. And they are very impassioned, and they are clearly, absolute super fans of the group. But I would say not all of them have the best voices, but that doesn't stop them.
Unkind.
But I really wanted to position in there the fact that there should be no barriers to the joy that music can bring. So if you want to sing a karaoke version of, a Smith song or any other song, there's absolutely nothing stopping you. Sing your heart out, whether you can keep in tune or not, just go for it. So that's really what I wanted. It's this articulation of the joy that sound and song can bring to us as human beings.
Shall we watch a little snippet that we have in the next slide?
Yeah. Now tell me everything. Tell me everything you want to tell me about how this relates to fandom for you and what fandom means to you.
Well, I think I'm interested in a really simple part of it, which is that the difference between enjoying your fandom publicly with a sort of sense of togetherness, like being like, the kind of history of subcultures, yada, yada. But in this particular work, we see small groups, couples, friends performing their love for this band, this like deeply melodramatic, theatrical kind of performance often. versus a very private experience of fandom, a kind of a feeling it within, feeling it in your headphones when you're walking down the street, kind of like this kind of dichotomy is sort of like interesting to me. And it's interesting to me in terms of an art experience too, where I think, like, what's the difference between loving an artwork and being an art fan? It doesn't matter. No, I don't think so. And it doesn't matter how many times you go back to your favorite work, you feel something and you can't help it. Like listening to your favorite song, you can't help it.
And there's something the other aspect of that is the way that this British, quite a niche group. I mean, they did not really become world famous. The Smiths. They were kind of super famous in the UK and Europe, and a little bit known in the US, but I don't think they really became that like a super group. But somehow, their music transcends cultural borders. So this particular edition of this film series, there are 3 films in this series, and this one was filmed in Indonesia. So the idea that the Smiths' music made its way to Indonesia and somehow generated all these really impassioned fans is kind of fascinating in itself.
In our next slide, we see the work of Samson Young here. And we go from this, as we described, extimate, joyful, sometimes melodramatic experience of sound and music and fandom. And then we go to something the tone is quite a shift here, and it's a really important shift that you make in the narrative. Can you talk to that, Adrian?
Yeah, so we with Phil's work, we started to kind of gesture towards the choral. So the way we as human beings do like to sing together, be together, sing in unison, produce harmony between our voices, if our voices are harmonious. And so what's extraordinary about Samson's work, he's a brilliant musician, very, very accomplished. And he worked with the Hong Kong Voices Choir to have them perform Bach's Christmas Oratorio. But he instructed them to mute the words. So they're articulating the words, but they're not really singing the words. And they're also concentrating on the breaths. And I think this has become, I find it quite unnerving, actually. It's like these kind of whispered words, which they're trying to tell me something, but I can't quite catch it. And there's clearly meaning in it, and they're all very intense. Their performance is very concentrated. And maybe we should look at it, and then we'll have a final word before we go on to the next slide. Yeah. So what I wanted to say about this is, of course, that the idea of muted voices is kind of deeply political now. The idea that people are not able to speak what they are encouraged not to speak in the words that they want to speak, or they're encouraged not to say the things that they want to say. So I think over the years since this particular work has been made, it has become more and more political. And so I think it's a very subtle, unnerving reflection.
Shall we move around the corner and look at the next work, which this work has been a kind of center point all the way along from the very earliest conversations I know that you've had, Adrian, about the exhibition. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why, and also I'll talk a little bit about your first encounter with this work, because I think it's really interesting and really lovely.
Yeah, I remember I first encountered this work in New York. I think it's in the year that it was made, I think 2001. And I immediately contacted the artist because I wanted to show it at Tate Liverpool, where I was curator at Tate Liverpool at the time. And having encountered this work in the US, I was so moved by it. For me, it's an incredibly moving piece. The 40-part motet itself is it's a religious piece of music, but it's not so evident actually as it's sung in Latin. The idea that in this particular work, you are surrounded by the choir. Normally with choral performances, it's a kind of face-to-face kind of performance. The choir is facing you, you're facing them, and they sing at you. And in this instance, you're literally in the middle of 40 singers, 40-part harmony. It's like 40-part surround sound. It's an extraordinary experience. And I find it deeply moving. There was a point where I was unable to speak about it because I was getting a bit choked up when I was speaking about it. But there's something about the idea of all these voices coming together to combine to make something which is so sublime. And there's a moment in the performance where there's a transition from everyday to this kind of vocal performance moment or mode. And that shift is quite extraordinary as well.
I'm interested in the ways in which we've spoken about a different kind of immersive experience. I think when we think about museum going or making exhibitions in the museum, we talk a lot about immersive experiences. But this is architecturally, physically stripped back. And there's something about this one-to-one connection with sound that is so powerful in this work.
I mean, I've noted whenever I'm at the museum, I always go in there at least once or twice and experience the whole thing all the way through. And I've noted that with almost all our visitors, it's a very introspective moment. People tend to look down, or they tend to look up, or they tend to look out of the oculus windows into the far distance. And it's evident that they are really focused on the auditory experience, because it's so extraordinary auditory experience. It's very rare that you're in a situation where you have the choir of Salisbury Cathedral in the UK singing at you, and you can choose if you want to go and listen to the baritone or the soprano from choir 1 to 8. It's entirely up to you. You can walk around and experience the individual voices if you want to. And Janet sees this as a very three-dimensional sort of sculptural sound work, actually. And you will know from having worked with the Tonmeister who traveled in to supervise the installation that our space is, in this particular instance, is very well suited to the presentation of this work, almost cathedral-like, he was saying.
In that conversation was a lot of discussion about kind of setting the conditions down, or laying down the conditions for our visitors to feel a moment of transcendence. And of course, then the question is, how do you come back to earth? How do you reorientate after this? Perhaps you have this moment of great interiority, as you described, or perhaps you go off in a way. And how do you come back?
Yeah, well, my experience of showing this at Tate Liverpool, we had a lot of people who were very moved and were moved to tears in Tate Liverpool. And so we had to have a kind of sort of a calming space. We built another space outside the gallery where people could just kind of compose themselves, have a little sit down, and just kind of bring themselves back down to earth, as it were. And in our exhibition here, we've got that little kind of decompression space. And then it moves us quickly into a space where you can become more active. Here exactly. So this is the part of the exhibition we call Playlist. And we're encouraging people, our amazing colleagues, Dina and Houdin, pulled this space together with us. It's full of very creative ideas of how to make sound. You can see 3 of us are jumping on these little shapes on the floor, which all have hidden sounds in them. So depending on when you stand on it, you might hear a cow, or you might hear a cat, or a doorbell, or a car horn, or something. And then at the bottom of the slide here, there's an interactive and engagement space where you can make your own abstract minimal score, or in some cases, not minimal at all. And then the stage is yours as an opportunity for you to try and play that score however you wish, or not, or just make sound, or just play the keys and listen to what comes out of it. It's a space where I'm encouraging people to just make any kind of sound, make sound, and don't feel that you have to be able to read Western musical notation like my granddad did.
That may or may not be a kind of group experience.
Yeah.
May or may not be a performance. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then we're not quite done. We have one last artwork to speak about before we ask Sin to come back and join us. So we need to talk about cats.
Well, not really cats. My focus here is on the Arnold Schoenberg bit. So this work by Corey Archangel is, it's a fantastic work to end the show on. This particular piece of music, which was written by Arnold Schoenberg, this is called 3 Pieces for Piano, Tre Klavierstücke, was premiered in 1930, which is when my granddad was, my granddad was born in 1909. This was premiered in 1909. So it's like a beginning and ending for me, very nicely rounding off that thing. But what interested me about this was that Corey did not somehow edit or force these cats to play the Schoenberg. He just wrote a piece of software that harvested these clips from the internet and then edited them all together so that they do in fact play the Schoenberg Klavierstücke works. So it's like my slightly humorous gesture to the fact that maybe we don't need to be trained as musicians anymore to make or recreate music. We just need to have the ability to write software that can do it for us.
Or be a cat.
Or buy a cat and teach your cat how to play Schoenberg, which is another option.
I think at this point we're bringing Sin back into the conversation to
Awesome.
Look at and invite audience questions.
For those of you who joined us midway through the program, we're here with Adrian and Amita, the curators of Orchestral Manoeuvres, C Sound, Field Sound, B Sound at ArtScience Museum. And it's an exhibition that explores sound through sculpture, installation, and music, developed for the museum's 10th anniversary. And we will be going into Q&A with both of them right now. And we'll try to get to as many of the questions we have received from you as we can. So Adrian and Amita, I would love to start with a couple of maybe interconnected questions around the acoustic creation of space, the expanded idea of listening, and the title making for the exhibition. This show is installed in the level 3 galleries of the museum. And level 3 is a very curious space for us to work with because the galleries kind of circle around our building's rain oculus feature. And each of these galleries carries quite different acoustics qualities as well. How did the architecture of this space shape the process of developing the show? And of course, the other obvious factor to consider for this exhibition is that sound-based works can be quite a tricky proposition because they don't stay put. And one of the things that strikes one as we move through orchestral maneuvers is the very complex, layered soundscape, suggesting how an exhibition like this might also be configured as a possibility for reciprocal listening. And then how did you approach maybe balancing the curatorial presentation of the works in terms of thinking about this multiplicity and the dialogue between the various works with the more practical considerations of whether to embrace the sound characteristics of a certain piece and allowing them to bleed into other works and spaces, or making provisions to isolate another piece, for instance. And how did all this then inform the title making of the exhibition? Sorry for this big broad question, but I think it might be useful to start with this for the start of our Q&A.
Yeah, I think every one of those questions is, we've battled with it. Amita and I have been battling with those those dilemmas for the last 2 years or more. I think in terms of the space, there's not much we can do about it. We have to accept that it's a very reverberant space. So the fact that the galleries kind of swoop up into the petals or the fingertips of the museum adds a certain acoustic quality to the space. It's very echoey, which works perfectly for some galleries, but it doesn't for others. So that was a consideration. And in terms of the way that we've selected the works or placed the works in the space, for example, earlier we talked about Zul and Shenzhen and Xiao's works all in that space. We just had to accept that there's going to be sound bleed. There's sound bleed in everything that we do. There's very little opportunities in our lives to be in a perfectly silent place. And that's part of the world that we live in. There's sounds around us all the time. So we have to accept it. We just accepted it. Amita, do you want to talk about the title then?
I like that idea of like just accepting it, and that we, like, to use a horrible expression that perhaps shouldn't anymore, like leaning into that. I think that Cindy mentioned that the exhibition's on our level 3 galleries, and it does sit in this inner circle around the oculus. So I think we kept talking about the exhibition being in the round, and as we would know from an experience of like a concert or a gig where it is in the round, sometimes you get you get a performer's back. Sometimes you get a kind of like, you get a deep bass thrown at you. Sometimes you get a kind of like a top note of a whatever instrument. And so this experience of music is not is sort of set against the kind of strict, and Adrian mentioned this kind of very how do I say it, like a kind of strict rule making, like you cannot put a pencil mark out of place on the page, but yet performance is messy. It's like life. And so, and I think the last thing I think I'll say is, like, we had a lot of discussions about, and you mentioned it too, Sin, like that sound is moving. Adrian, you mentioned this too, that our experiences of sound is fluid and constant. So and changing, absolutely. Sometimes accumulating. And so why the exhibition narrative itself is not linear. This is a kind of like temporal experience as well as a spatial experience. I like how you described it as a kind of like acoustic, not your exact words, Sin, but acoustic space
creation of the space.
Yeah, it's difficult, and so is the history of music. So yeah, it's great if you can come away with what appealed to you, what you wanted to tune into. I think that's a great outcome.
It's a little bit like Amita said earlier when she compared, to the curation of it to a kind of a conductor with an orchestra, because we did have to think about how we managed the presence of each of the sound artworks sort of sequentially through the space. And so that's where the title Orchestral Manoeuvres came from, because we kind of had to maneuver the orchestration of each artwork. And it's been fantastic and to work with the artists. Many of them, they've all been so generous. When we asked Zul if he could just like tweak his artwork so there was a moment of silence where Xiao's works could stand out, he was like, yes, I totally understand what you're trying to do. Let me see what I can do. I'll come into the space. We work in the space with the other sounds around, and I'll adjust and modify, which is exactly what musicians in an orchestra do. So it's been wonderful to work with the artists because they've been so generous.
And for me, there's something very poetic in the idea that sound is egalitarian and indiscriminate, and listening is never horizontal, right? Because sounds bleed, they blend, they phase into, and they shade one another. I suppose this is the fundamental challenge of putting this kind of exhibition together, but at the same time, it's the fundamental subject matter as well. There are so many ideas to investigate and questions that come up when you start thinking about collection of works for an exhibition's premise, then getting to build the show. So my next question is there a piece that holds particular meaning for you as you're working on this exhibition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that you just said about how sounds come together and they form kind of something more, like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts kind of thing. That's exactly Janet Cardiff's work for me. You know, each of those voices is rather beautiful by itself, but it transcends that when they all come together. You know, there are moments where the harmonies blend and the hairs on your arms stand up, and it's like phew, quite a moment. So that's always been central to the exhibition concept. I really wanted to bring it to Singapore. And then Mel's work, which kind of gestures to so many other ideas and chapters in the exhibition. It speaks to cage, it speaks to chants, it speaks to the idea of written scores and what that could look like, what it can be. It speaks to the idea of a performing object. You know, it speaks to my original failure as a musician when I was a kid. So it's kind of like, it speaks to so many things. Those are the two artworks which have really were at the very, very core of the exhibition.
Amita, what about you?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to refuse to answer your question, Sin, and pick up instead on something that's kind of sitting in our conversation, which is like the politics of sound, the politics of music. You mentioned a second ago, Sin, like this democratizing, this like democratic medium, right? And a kind of artwork that it's an excerpt from Pauline Oliveiras's Sonic Meditations in 1977. The reason that I kind of want to draw attention to it is it picks up again on like, what do we need in this moment? What are we kind of searching for in this moment? And it looks this work is kind of referencing a whole lot of group work that she did in the 70s and early 80s, a sound as a kind of a healing mechanism, like breath work as a kind of sound making opportunity, togetherness as the most important part, and music as a byproduct. She talked about like having your ears wide open and what can come of that. And I feel that in the exhibition, and I'm feeling that in this conversation. So yeah.
It's a very beautiful work and speaks to our particular moment now, you know, when through the pandemic, it's been so challenging. People have been thinking about mental health, thinking about how they can be together with people. There have been so many manifestations online of choirs coming together through Zoom and other platforms, you know, so that they can still sing in chorus somehow, despite the undeniable lag. I think those things are all very, very beautiful. And that idea that we can somehow, being in nature is not just about seeing nature, it's about smelling and listening to nature, you know, and that is the kind of whole health, a holistic approach to one's well-being includes sound and music.
On the topic of the current moment, we're all very aware that this particular period presents challenges that are associated with mounting an exhibition like this. But collaborative energies are always very integral to how we develop and present projects, and especially so during this period. Are there any sort of behind-the-scenes stories that you might be able to share about our artists or lenders or the art installation team in putting this show together?
Amita, do you want to share any information about our challenges?
I think one of the things that we have kind of reflected on since the exhibition opened is what an amazing thing it was when we were in kind of not in a partial lockdown to have Janet Cardiff's Tonmeister come and install the work. And I don't think it's, yes, he came here and it was an incredible sort of self-sacrifice and, a difficult thing, right? But that aside, I think what was really interesting was I keep thinking about, perfumiers have a nose. Well, he is the ear for that work. He's installed that work for over 10 years in a multitude of like museums, galleries, churches, once outdoors in a music festival. And so he's heard this work all over the world. And he came to ArtScience Museum and heard it here and really listened to our space. And that, so when we talk about this, referencing the Pauline Oliveros work, again, I guess, it's like this deep listening of a space, deep listening of listening of architecture. And I kind of relate that back, that amazing experience of having that incredible conversation with him about what does our space sound like? What does the work sound like in this space? Relates back also to, I think, Adrian's premise, which you were talking about it as tuning into our building. And so that connection in that moment with him in the space was kind of a real like, like this is we're very fortunate here. Yeah, for me.
As a closing note to today's program, then I wonder if I could ask both of you what you would like people to take away from their encounter with Orchestral Manoeuvres.
I would like people to think as much about what you listen to as what you look at. And, museums are pretty much about the visual. So let's also consider, the aural, or what you hear in the space of a museum. That's important. And I also want people to take away the fact that now you don't have to be a trained musician. You don't have to read music. If you want to make sound, you want to make music, just go ahead and do it. Any way you can do it. And there's no obligation to learn to play a traditional musical instrument. Just go and make your own. Why not? The futurists did. So just go for it.
Yeah, I think I like the idea that because of some of the prompts that our amazing education team have put for a kind of like 10 years and under experience in the exhibition, kind of really breaking down listening and music making for our younger visitors. I like that there might be a moment where you go outside of the museum and you hop on the train or MRT and you just listen to it again. You listen to it differently. Maybe you start to eavesdrop on conversations a little more. Like, I like that you can become a sneak after coming to this show, and that might be like a radical and slightly devious act of tuning in to the city.
Thank you both so much for walking through the exhibition making of Orchestral Manoeuvres and offering your insights into the curatorial process of the show. And also a wonderful thanks to everyone who has been spending your time with us at this Curators in Dialogue live stream event today. We would love to hear your feedback on the program, which you can share with us through an online survey by scanning the QR code that's coming onto the screen. We very much hope you get a chance to see the show. It really is such a beautiful invitation to slow down, to think about the different ways of experiencing sound and music, and also reflect on how we listen. And hopefully this exhibition reprioritizes our senses in a way to look at art, but also listen to sound and music in the same space. Next month, on the 13th to 24th of November, we're presenting Sound Islands Resound, a 2-weekend festival that embraces different dimensions of sound and different possibilities of listening. This highlight event is co-curated with Sound Islands and staged as a key programming accent of this exhibition, featuring performances, interventions, screenings, and masterclasses. So look out for event details, which will be released in the upcoming weeks. You can also stay up to date with everything that's happening at ArtScience Museum and on our online content platform, ArtScience at Home, via our website and subscribing to our social channels. It's been really lovely having all of you with us today. Please do stay safe and keep well in the meantime. And we hope to see all of you soon. Thank you so much again, Adrian and Amita.
Thank you, Sin.
All right, bye.
Bye.